Hey everybody, welcome to Reason Review. I'm Reed Nicewonder. This is the show where we seek to know the case, to know it in its most plausible and persuasive form, with the goal of exchanging error for truth, and what is almost as great a benefit, the clear perception and livelier impression of the truth produced by its collision with error, for the good of all to help make the world a better place. Today we strive towards the morality of public discussion with Helen Pluckrose. Welcome, Helen.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Would you like to give a quick intro of yourself, Helen?
Well, I'm the editor of Aereo magazine, which is a reason and evidence centred liberal humanist outlet, and we publish any good arguments, really, from whatever political position. And we're very much supportive of viewpoint diversity and freedom of speech. I have a background in late medieval religious writing, and I took part in what has come to be called the Grievance Studies affair or hoax with James Lindsay and Peter Bigotry.
What's happened?
Helen, I caught her smoking.
Helen!
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 Never do that ever again.
Honestly.
And this whole thing that everybody and everything is racist and sexist would never have been able to take off and get much traction if it weren't being made to look legitimate by a scholarly enterprise that's been pushing it for 5 decades.
It's about knowledge. It's about how we decide what is true. People don't tend to think about the ways in which they decide what is true. It just seems to come naturally to them because it comes from the water that we swim in, and we're just gradually, bit by bit, undermining the long history of going with evidence, of going with consistent liberal ethics. It's frightening.
Yep, thank you so much for being on here. This is going to be perfect. So cool. Let's just jump right into it. The question is, what is the best set of ideas and values to make the world a better place? So, Helen, would you like to help build the case?
Yep, I will, of course, argue for secular liberal humanism as being the best set, and I will point out that there's plenty of evidence for that.
Cool. We're using the website Chialo to help make the case here. So I've got a few broad answers, and I'd love to get your ratings for these. So on a scale from 0 to 4, where 0 is false, 1 is improbable, 2 is plausible, 3 is probable, and 4 is true, where would you rate feminism as having the best set of ideas and values?
On implausible, that'll be 1.
Improbable?
Improbable, yeah.
Cool.
There we go.
And humanism?
I think probable.
Probable. Progressivism?
Plausible.
Plausible. Conservatism?
Improbable.
Improbable.
Yeah, is there a very improbable?
There is a
Sorry.
false.
Yeah, false.
0.
False will do. Yeah, please.
False will do for okay. Liberalism.
Yep, that's the furthest one at that end. What's that one? Very probable or true? Yeah.
True. Cool. Religion.
False.
False. Okay. Critical social justice.
False. We need a minus figure there for that one.
All right, so I'll sort these claims. All right, the first segment of the interview I like to call Your Own Side of the Case. We focus on your highest rated answer, liberalism. So what would you say are like the top 2 to 3 reasons for this answer?
Well, liberalism, if we're looking at it as a philosophy and as an approach rather than as a political position, because I know that people watching from America could equate liberalism with leftism, and people watching from Australia can equate it with right wing. So, but I am talking about that real sort of philosophy of freedom and equal opportunities, universalism. Everybody should have the same rights, and individuality. Everybody is an individual, and the individual is the most important element of society. And so we're focusing very much on freedom and the sort of incremental improvement of society. So that, I said plausible with progressivism, because liberalism is inherently progressive. It always tries to make society a little bit more liberal, a little bit more fair. It takes problems one at a time, and it wants to improve things. So it's not like conservatism, where it will just conserve traditions almost indiscriminately, and it's not like socialism, where it's a revolution or social justice. It's a progress. So it really is inherently progressive, and we have a great amount of evidence that this has worked over the modern period. We've got steadily more liberal as theocracy has retreated, and then feudalism first retreated, and then we've done away gradually with patriarchy and slavery and colonialism, and got increasingly liberal. In the 60s and 70s, we've had the civil rights movements, which were inherently liberal movements. They said to mainstream society, you have rights and we don't. We only want to have the same rights that you do. And that was a very liberal movement, and it convinced people. So I think the facts are on the side of liberalism.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah, so now let's repeat one more for your next highest reason. Why does humanism have the best set of ideas and values to make the world a better place?
Because it puts humans at the centre of everything. We're not relying on a god or anything larger than or outside of humans. So I think, as a secular person, that humans are precisely what we need to focus on. And it also puts us all on the same level. There are different groups of humans, but we all have the same ability for reason, for compassion, for all elements of human nature. And therefore it's important to think universally about humans as a single tribe, rather than more narrowly as nationalism or identity groups.
Perfect. What is the top 2 to 3 reasons against conservatism?
I think conservatism has a tendency to try to hold us back. With social conservatism, we end up getting women and men sort of railroaded into specific gender roles. With economic conservatism, we end up not providing for the most vulnerable in society.
Gotcha. Okay, let's go with the next lowest.
That would be religion.
Okay.
Yeah, religion isn't quite as bad, because people can practice their religion in a liberal and science-based way, but it still is necessarily held back because it has that supernatural element, and it has that larger than humans appealing to written law element. And at its worst, it encourages homophobia, sexism, violence, persecution, censorship.
Gotcha. Now let's go with, let's see.
The critical social justice.
Yeah, go ahead and go with that.
Okay, so that isn't the one I've put as the biggest problem, but it is the one that I'm addressing, because I think it has its aims right, but its methods wrong. So it has a denial of objective truth. It denies universality. It denies individuality. It is neurotic about language and power structures, and is really quite mythic and fundamentalist in its practice.
Cool. All right, so we did the top-rated reasons and the lowest-rated reasons, and why you think your good reasons are good and bad reasons are bad. Let's now try to steel man the answers you think are bad. What would you say conservatism thinks its best reasons are? What kind of case would it make for itself?
Underlying conservatism is the belief that things shouldn't be changed unless there is a very, very good reason. So the way things are working now, or have been working for our parents and our grandparents, have probably survived because they have been good. They shouldn't just be ripped out by the roots and thrown away in the name of progress, which isn't to say they never do progress. I mean, quite a lot now we've seen that gay and lesbian people are now able to be conservatives, which wouldn't have been the case even 20 years ago. So there is there is some progress there, but it's very, very slow with conservatism, and they act as the drag on society trying to progress.
Perfect. And what would you say religion has? Like, what is the positive reasons religion gives for itself?
I used to believe that nobody needed religion at all, that we could just reason people out of believing in it and they'd be absolutely fine. But I have come to believe that this isn't the case, that there are an awful lot of people who do need to have these big narratives that give them meaning and purpose. And if you sort of take those away from them, which of course we can't in a liberal society and wouldn't want to, but then they're going to find another one. This need for community, for moral good, for purpose, for meaning isn't going to go away. So religion, it can hold people together, it can keep them feeling comforted and secure. If I'm steel manning them, yeah, that the simplest argument is that this God actually exists and he is perfectly good, and so you should do what he says. That's the very clear case for religious people to give. And if they were right, if God did actually exist and he was going to punish or reward us all eternally, we probably should do what it wants. But there's no reason to think that's the case, so I can't really put myself in that position.
Okay. And how would you steel man critical social justice? What would they say are the best reasons?
Well, I think for the strongest argument for this, it would be that it's focusing very much on discourses and how we talk about things. And we have seen a big change over the last 50 years, particularly with how we talk about men and women, how we talk about LGBT people, racial issues. Things have changed. We've come out of the whole sort of Jim Crow thing for you. We've come out of the over here where we used to have signs when the first Jamaicans and everybody started coming over, and it was no dogs, no blacks, no Irish. We've moved on a long way since then. So the social justice people who are working on postmodern ideas would say that we've got these embedded prejudices from the past, and we've got rid of some of them. We've made legal changes, but we still need to really get at those attitudes that are underlying everything, become able to see them, and then uproot them. And we can't do that if we're wandering around saying, well, it's all about universality and individuality, because we need to pay some attention to social groups and how they relate to power.
Gotcha. And what are the main criticisms you've heard of humanism that people put forward?
That it's generally a bit naive, that it thinks that all humans are the same and we can just say that, you know, I don't see race, or I don't see sex even, which we don't tend to say, but yeah, but people understand humanism as believing that we've already achieved this. So it's an idea that we already are one big happy family, and it's a bit naive, and you only can think like that if you've been a relatively privileged person who hasn't had to think in any other way. Of course, religious people would make the criticism of humanism that it displaces God, and it's an arrogant attempt of man to put his own reason and his own logic above the written word of God.
Good stuff. And last one, let's go with liberalism. What are the main criticisms of liberalism that you've heard?
Well, I think the Conservatives will criticise liberalism because they see it as always trying to progress, and Conservatives often see liberals as indiscriminately trying to progress and not having enough respect for institutions that have served us well. The social justice activists see liberalism as a kind of privileged blindness. They think liberal ideas are something you can have if you're a straight white man, and the world is already set up for you. It's too slow, and it's generally not very productive of social change from their perspective. And then you'd have the socialists and the Marxists who would criticise liberalism because of its support for capitalism and corporate culture, where it doesn't want a revolution. It wants to make things fairer for workers. It wants to make sure there are strong social programs, but it's not trying to overturn society as it is, defeat capitalism, and achieve what they would see as a real, genuine justice.
Sweet. Got a good bunch of good reasons here. Let's just now go on to segment 3, the whole force of difficulty. This is where we focus on a claim you most likely have like a nuanced position on. So the claim is representation matters.
Star Trek helped me see that representation matters. And I've come to believe deeply that reflective representation, seeing yourself, your experience, your people's experience in the places and positions that matter most in this world, is critical to meaningful civic engagement.
What would you have reasons for or against this?
I would say that representation does matter. Anybody who has a child will know that children get very pleased and excited when there's someone they can pretend to be. They feel more likely that they can pretend to be someone who is the same sex as them, maybe the same race as them. I don't know. My daughter doesn't, but we're white, which is the majority. So I think that there should be more representation of minority groups. But we get to a bit of a problem when we get right into the social justice ideas where you both have to have representation of absolutely everybody.
I stand before you today in all of my blackness, in all of my femaleness, and in all of my womanhood to talk about a subject that is easily dismissed if you are not both black and female. And that is the need for representation, the need for a woman like me, women like me to be represented everywhere and in all spaces, because representation matters.
But you cannot culturally appropriate or step out of your lane and play someone or write someone who isn't from your social group.
The main problem with cultural appropriation comes from dominant groups borrowing from marginalized groups who face oppression or have been stigmatized for their cultural practices throughout history.
And then you also have to be very, very careful how you include people in various kinds of things, because there's always a way to problematize any kind of representation of anyone. If it's in a film or in the writing of a book, we've seen, for example, what's happened in the young adults section with books, where books have been withdrawn because somebody has complained that somebody writing from her own cultural background nevertheless said things that could be upsetting to African Americans, I think it was. And so we have this kind of case where you really can't get it right in that case. So I would go with the liberal idea, which is an equal opportunities. Try to get as many different types of people in there as you can. Be inclusive, be welcoming. Don't go to a neurotic extent where you're then making everything you do, and I'm talking in the realm of art right now, which might not have been what you meant, but make everything you do politicized. You will take all of the joy out of everything if you try to make all your characters perfect and and give them a political message. But in areas such as, do we want equal representation of women in physics, for example? No, I don't think we do. We can accept that men and women have different interests on average. That shouldn't make us complacent, so that we stop looking in case there are any barriers for anybody of any sex, any race, any sexuality. But we shouldn't assume that everybody's going to make the same decisions in the same numbers. And so trying to get a quota of representation then is what's known as blank slatism, which really doesn't accept that among the genders that anyone can choose differently.
Amazing. That was a wealth of reasons. Thank you. So another possible nuanced claim. How about this? The economy is the foundation of politics.
I'm afraid that I would have to say, when it comes to economy, that I'm not really qualified to speak about it. I have not researched the economy in great depth because it doesn't interest me as much as culture and society. So I think the most humble thing I can do is say I don't know.
Perfect. How about this? Postmodernity has been institutionalized.
So now you have enough things in your brackets, and I can tell you pretty much the scariest thing that I think I've thought ever, and it's something I just can't shake because it has that really uncomfortable status of something I really don't want to have be true, but increasingly suspect is true. But the long and short of it is that we really are in postmodernity now, like postmodernity has institutionalized?
I mean, postmodernism hasn't sort of taken over everybody everywhere. We can still just relate to each other and do our jobs and maybe not have to think constantly about power and knowledge and language, which is what's at the root of postmodern theory. But in another way, the culture has changed. We are now seeing a lot more focus on language, how we're speaking about things. So we'll see this everywhere from universities. I think somebody said there's 90% of the universities in the UK have got some kind of censorship going on, some things you can't say. And even on social media. So Twitter will ban certain things, Facebook will ban certain things.
But I don't look at the political spectrum of people when I'm looking at their tweets.
Right, you have a bias.
I don't know who they are.
You're biased, and you're targeting specific individuals because your rules support this perspective.
No. I don't agree with that.
Well,
so can you be clear, though, in like what rules support that perspective?
Specifically, the easiest one is misgendering, right? Because that's so clearly ideological. If you ask a conservative, what is misgendering? They'll say if someone is biologically male and you call them, she, biologically male and you call them a she, that's misgendering. That's a conservative view. The progressive view is inverted. So now you actually have in your policies a rule against the conservative perspective.
I have a rule against the abuse and harassment of trans people on our platform.
If you're found to have said something problematic, then you are seen as talking into a discourse that can harm people, create a hostile environment, even lead to suicide, commit discursive violence. And so this is, people can lose their jobs about this. We've seen Google fire someone. We've seen Macy's have to apologise for a bowl they made because it was fat-phobic, apparently. It was measuring out portion sizes. And so, yes, I think we can say that there has been an institutionalization, but it varies in which institution. So in the universities, you see a very high degree of it. The elite universities, you see much less in community colleges. You see it in the media and with big tech companies, but you probably don't see it very much in agriculture or building work. So yeah, it's there. It's not the biggest problem in the world, but it is getting established and we do need to push against it.
Sweet, sweet. How about this? Intention does not matter nearly as much as impact.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that this is, again, something that needs to be treated with a great amount of nuance. Anybody who thinks that intention doesn't matter should think, how would you feel if your partner elbowed you in the face, accidentally or on purpose? That's a very, very different situation, isn't it? I use this example because my husband actually did that once. He was putting on a t-shirt and he hit me in the face with his elbow. All I had was a sore nose, but if he had done that deliberately, my heart would have been broken, my relationship would have been over. Intention really does matter. But that isn't to say that people cannot feel an impact of something that wasn't intentional. There are ways to address this. If you think somebody is being hurtful without realizing it, you can approach them about that. You can say, I know you're not meaning to be unkind, but actually that hurts my feelings because.
If we had like a pie chart of intention and impact, how should it be split up in your mind?
Oh, I don't know. You're trying to measure things. I think it's just varies so much on how reasonable it is to feel the impact that you're feeling. If you're feeling very offended by somebody maybe using a word like packy. Now, in the UK, that is really associated with a racist attitude. I know a couple of Americans who didn't realise this. If they were to use that word over here and a Pakistani Brit were to say to them, actually, that's quite an insulting word here. I know you didn't know that, but I think you should. That would be quite reasonable. But if somebody was offended by something much less tangible, like the whole idea of microaggressions came when Gerald Wing Sue was asked to move on an aeroplane to balance it out, and he assumed that it happened to him because he wasn't white. The flight attendant said that isn't the case at all, but he was still offended. The impact, he is almost certainly completely responsible for how he experienced that. If the flight attendant had not intended it in any way. So you see, it depends so much on what is reasonable.
Gotcha. Bigotry can only flow downhill along gradients of systemic power.
Yeah, and this is where we have two complications of this. There is some truth in the idea that prejudice is much more harmful when powerful people exercise it than when marginalised people do. Yes, okay, we can understand that. That doesn't make it any morally better for someone who perceives themselves as marginalised to take this a bigoted attitude. We might excuse it, but we don't really want our ethics to be something that can be excused. We want them to be something that can be defended. Also, the understanding of systemic power from critical social justice is extremely simplistic, where in fact power dynamics can change depending on what situation you're in. If you are in a university, a very liberal university, then you might not be in a position of power if you're a white man, because you're in this environment in which that isn't an advantage if you're studying gender studies or ethnic studies or anything like that. But if you were on a building site or something, perhaps there could be more prejudice on the grounds of race. If you're searching for a home in maybe in a majority white neighbourhood, perhaps white people would be more likely to be offered the home than people of colour. We don't know. Well, we do know. We know there's more prejudice against non-white people than against white people at the moment, but this isn't stable across all kinds of arenas. And in the cultural sphere, it is much more forgivable to say something racist about white people than it is to say something racist about non-white people, because of this idea of reparative justice.
Gotcha.
I think that one was a bit babbly.
That's fine. That's fine. Let's go to segment 4, which I call Reason Refutation. And I just have a ton of claims that I'd love to see how you would refute them or try to counter them. The educator has the duty of not being neutral.
Yeah, I would strongly oppose that one. I'd agree with people who point out that being entirely neutral is probably impossible because we are human beings. We do all have biases. But trying to be neutral, I think, as we've written in our book, I think somewhere, that it used to be considered a good sign if a teacher's students couldn't tell what political position they had. Now that has kind of gone out of the window, and we're seeing a much stronger link between activism and scholarship. And this is a difference between what is and what ought to be. When we're in scholarship, we need to be looking at how things are and trying to understand them, coming from a position that we don't already understand everything fully. Whereas activists tend to think that they already have the solution, and then they read everything through that solution. And so we end up with something which doesn't look much like scholarship, but confirmation bias for an ideology.
Cool. Gotcha. Thank you. The commitment to the personal is political will help make the world a better place.
No, I don't think it will. I think politics is for people, so there's always a personal impact from all of that. But trying to project your personal situation onto society is just going to end up with confusion and incoherence.
Okay. Women need special protections in the public sphere.
Right. No, I don't think we do at all. I get quite angry about that idea. There's perhaps some truth in the claim that that some workplaces are more set up for men, because men, on average, are more assertive and confrontational and less risk-averse than women. So I wouldn't oppose giving some thought to how to make a workplace more welcoming if a woman seems to be intimidated in it. But we shouldn't assume that it is women who are going to feel that way. There's an awful lot of timid men and assertive women. So I find that claim infantilizing and disempowering, and I'd rather do without it.
Gotcha. Good stuff. How about this one? The gender binary is an example of structural oppression.
And when you can understand gender as a social construct, it's a lot easier to understand how our culture can be oppressive to people who experience gender differently than man or woman. Because man and woman are words that we invented as a culture to describe certain phenomena, and they don't describe all of the possible options. So when one of those doesn't fit you, it's not because you're weird. It's because socially we've constructed a system that doesn't work. A system that doesn't describe the experiences of all of the people in our culture.
No, the gender binary is a recognition of sex, of being a bimodal sexual reproducing species. This doesn't mean that intersex people don't exist, or that trans people who experience themselves as being the opposite gender to what their body says they are aren't actually experiencing a genuine a thing. We don't entirely know what trans identity is yet, but science is beginning to tell us. It's beginning to find things in pheromones, in genes, in brains, which tell us that trans people are experiencing something that affects their gender, and I think we need to be supportive of them without ideologizing it.
Cool, great. How about this one? Critical social justice activists are a fringe minority that has no large effect.
So I think the most important thing in my mind to engage with people on the right is show them that the people that have been out there fear-mongering about so-called SJWs are lying to them. They are not honestly representing that is a tiny fraction of the left that does not represent the big ideas of the left in any way. And try to get them to see that they've been bamboozled by whoever it is that came to the campus or whose videos they watched on YouTube that convinced them that this is a big problem. Is it a problem? Sure. I mean, like, it exists, and I've spoken out against it, but they don't have a controlling stake in the left at this point in time. They don't have a controlling stake in the narrative. And it's sad, actually, that a lot of people get sucked into these echo chambers when we're really talking about a very small sliver of the left. That's the reality.
I would agree that they're a fringe minority, but I think they have far too much social respectability at the moment, and that's probably because of their position in universities and in the media, but also because we really are a society that doesn't like racism, sexism, or homophobia. It hasn't been that long since there were Jim Crow laws, since women weren't being paid as much, since it was illegal to be gay. So people really do want to support the idea of social justice, and they're terrified of being called racist, sexist, or homophobic if they go against it. So that's what gives it a lot of power.
Gotcha. Society is constructed in systems of power and privilege.
Yeah. Okay, so this is on what level are we talking about here? We do have power structures, we do have rich people and poor people, and some people with more power than others. But in the social justice, the critical social justice mindset, these are really quite nebulous forces of white supremacy, patriarchy, cisnormativity, the assumption that everyone will be the same sex as their genitals, heteronormativity, the assumption that everyone is heterosexual. So these sort of forces are believed to have pervaded all of society until you and I are speaking now. You will not be able to talk to me without the power imbalance of patriarchy going on. You are in a more powerful position than me simply because you're a man. You will have assumptions about my intelligence and my competence as a speaker because you are a man. Now, I don't think that's remotely true. I think that would be a very paranoid reading of the situation, and this is where a social justice analysis of power and privilege really does go astray, whereas a more sort of economic type of analysis that we sometimes get from the sort of socialists and social democrats, which says some people have got much better options in life. They have a private education, they have a university fund, they have a quiet house. You know, that's a perfectly empirical and reasonable statement, and that's something that we can actually look at improving for, say, children who don't have those advantages.
Perfect. Cool. Thank you. The connection between critical social justice and postmodernism is tenuous at best. I just watched your interview or a conversation with Thaddeus yesterday. That was really great.
Over the last few years, several prominent public intellectuals have been claiming that this thing they call postmodernism is responsible for all the authoritarian and hysterical politics coming out of college campuses. And I've been claiming over and over again that A, these people haven't read any postmodernism, and B, that the connection between what we now call social justice or identity politics and postmodernism is tenuous at best. Finally, two of them have actually done the reading and agreed to be on my show.
Yeah, it's not tenuous, but it isn't perfect. There's a very strong link because the critical social justice disciplines, which arose at the end of the 80s, deliberately said, they explicitly said, we are taking these elements of postmodernism, it's great, we can use it, it will be helpful, but we have to adapt it a bit. We have to have some objective truth. We have to accept that systems of power and privilege exist and that this causes some people to experience oppression. So they changed postmodernism, and somebody like Thaddeus, who is an old school postmodernist, would say that they changed it out of recognition. It's a travesty of what postmodernism was meant to be. Now, I don't think postmodernism was great in the first place, and I think that what we're seeing now is a legitimate use of parts of it, but it has become a meta-narrative. It has become a sort of great overarching simplistic story that explains how the world works, which is very, very different to what the original postmodernists intended it to be. But I think, and this is what I keep saying to people, I think the best way to understand how something can be linked but not true to is if you take the an analogy of Judaism and Christianity, because you couldn't say that the links between these two are tenuous. They're linear, we see them, but Jews don't think Christians have got it right, and Christians don't think Jews have got it right, so they're really not the same kind of thing when it comes to their central principles, what they're about.
Gotcha. Now let's, if you have time, there's one last segment I like to call From Dead Dogma to Living Truth, where we focus on a claim that you super agree with, and we just try to go down as deep as we can into the justifications and see how far we can go.
Mm-hmm.
So how about this one? We should attempt to remove social significance from identity categories.
Yeah, now that one is very, very important. This is the difference between liberalism and social justice. So the liberal ideal is that we stop attaching significance to people's sex or race. So we don't expect the doctor to be a man and the nurse to be a woman. We don't expect our lawyer to be white and our gardener to be Mexican. So this is what social significance is, and we don't want to stop people being men or women or having their identities. We just don't want them to be connected with sort of more or less important or powerful roles. So that's the aim of liberalism, to make sure everybody has access to everything. Now, Kimberlé Crenshaw in particular criticised this mainstream liberal idea, and she wanted to focus much more on categories, because obviously in order to remove social significance from categories, identity categories, you have to stop noticing them and referring to them all the time. But she thought that there was much more power in saying, I am black, than I am a person who happens to be black. So you don't put that humanity first, you put the identity first, and then you act from that position as a racialized identity category. And the liberal ideal is against that, because I don't think there's any evidence that it's actually helped, and quite a lot of evidence that it harms.
Why were the civil rights movements liberal projects?
Right, because they came from a position of inequality and they appealed to people for fairness. So Martin Luther King. He didn't say, as Robin DiAngelo does, white people are selfish, arrogant, whatever. He said, I want to see a time where the colour of people's skin doesn't matter. And he appealed to people on their shared concern for their children, on their shared belief in their future, on their shared belief in a liberal democracy.
Because I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
And this is why it has been so successful. It's why liberal feminism was so successful. When women asked for the same pay for the same work, when they asked for the same right to access professions and sort of had mortgages and that kind of, this was an appeal for fairness, and so people responded to that. And the same when gay men in this country were criminalised at one point. They said, we want to have our relationships the same as you do. So this is what's liberal. This is what is universal. This is, we want to have the same rights as you. Whereas identity politics, although proponents of it would disagree that they're actually asking for any different rights, and they're probably not, but what they are doing is they're taking one group as a monolithic oppressed category and putting it in juxtaposition with a monolithic oppressor category.
And for my very limited time with you, I'm going to be speaking about it in the big, big picture, right? White and people of color, right? The big binary, because I think on some level we can recognize that society is set up in that binary.
And this really does trigger the worst of humans. If you appeal to a human sense of fairness, it's likely to work. If you pile blame and opposition onto somebody, they're likely to get defensive. I think Steven Pinker is great with this when he writes about how we've expanded our circle of empathy as the world has got smaller, and we're not just sympathetic to the people in our village anymore, or even in our country. We can see a lot more. We've expanded. We care a lot about a greater range of humans.
So if human nature didn't change, what invigorated those better angels?
Well, among other things, our circle of empathy expanded. Years ago, our ancestors would feel the pain only of their family and people in their village. But with the expansion of literacy and travel, people started to sympathize with wider and wider circles: the clan, the tribe, the nation, the race, and perhaps eventually all of humanity.
And I think identity politics tries to draw this back in again. It tries to unintentionally trigger our most tribal sort of feelings, which are going to really sort of intensify our in-group loyalty and our out-group prejudice, which I think is a terrible mistake.
Cool, perfect. Progressives have stopped trying to effectively persuade people.
I think that is true if we're talking about critical social justice progressives. Yes, we've got this idea that there's an absolute certainty that they are right. They have seen through the discourses that are oppressing people. This is where that word woke comes from. They're awakened to the social reality and the layers of meaning that the rest of us can't see. And they've started asserting these to exist. They've started calling out and cancelling people who are saying the wrong things. They're not trying to argue their case. They're mostly just assuming that it's true. This isn't universal. I know a couple of people who strongly believe in social justice ideas and who argue for them. But mostly it is, there's not confidence in the idea that reasoned argument can work. The marketplace of ideas is very much a liberal project. That idea that if we let different arguments do battle against each other, it will emerge which idea is the superior one. And this is, I'm going to recommend everybody again to read Jonathan Rauch's Kindly Inquisitors if you haven't, because he is very convincing about how this has actually worked in practice.
When I began my own advocacy of gay marriage in 1996, I thought I might see some success in 2 or 3 generations, if ever. I should have been more confident in liberal science. You cannot be gay in America today and doubt that moral learning is real and that the open society fosters it. And so, 20 years on, I feel more confident than ever in answering the humanitarian and egalitarian challenges, even in their newly refined versions. The answer to bias and prejudice is pluralism, not purism. The answer, that is not to try to legislate bias and prejudice out of existence or to drive them underground, but to pit biases and prejudices against each other and make them fight in the open. That is how, in the crucible of rational criticism, moral error is burned away. That is how, in my lifetime, moral error was burned away.
That is the most important thing. Keep talking. Don't forget how to argue for your case and just assert everybody else is part of the problem.
Gotcha. Cool. I saw it on Twitter once. Someone posted, "Intersectionality is the ultimate betrayal of women's rights." I think that was Sarah Hayter.
Right. Oh, yes.
What would you say about that?
Yeah, I think Sarah clarified that, didn't she, by saying that she meant that in theory, that it would actually be quite good, but in practice, it isn't. It turns into a real sort of competitive and a nasty kind of, a kind of competition and shaming thing, because it really should be a good thing if we can look at different disadvantages people might face because of their race, because of their sex, because of their sexuality. If we can see that somebody who's got all three of these elements might have a different experience to somebody who hasn't, sounds great in theory. In practice, it ends up with one point of view being accepted as the authentic one for any group, and anybody who disagrees with it is seen as that horrible term native informant or Uncle Tom or something. So I think, yeah, intersectionality in practice has not worked out well for minority women particularly, or for any women really.
Gotcha.
Certainly hasn't done that well for men either.
The commitment to equality of outcome will not make the world a better place.
No, I don't think it would. I think that this would lead to people being pressured into doing things they didn't want to do. It would undermine the whole idea of meritocracy. And meritocracy is a very valuable thing as long as you understand it as a method which works, providing equality of opportunity is out there. Sometimes people think that when you say, I support meritocracy, you mean you think we already have one. I don't think we already have one. I think some people have much better opportunities in life than other people. But this is an ideal. So we do want the best people for whatever job, and that isn't going to break down neatly to 50% men, 50% women, and so many people of colour, or whatever, that's representing the demographics of the population. We need to focus on any problems in equality of opportunity and let the outcomes fall where they will.
Yeah. In like a liberal society, if we had full equal opportunity, there would be just difference in outcome. Yet new people coming into, the world, growing up with the existence of disparate outcomes already there in society, how can we have equal opportunity and with that there? Like, would we need equality of outcome to have equal opportunity, or what do you think of that?
I tend to think not. I understand that argument. It would just be for a short while. We'd have we'd equalise up the groups so that it got the ball rolling. But I would still be quite worried about that. I still think we do better to address the problem at an earlier stage. So I sometimes use the example of my husband and me. Now, I went to a private school. I had a big quiet house with parents who both very much enjoyed learning. I had a fund for university. I really did have every opportunity. My husband had to leave school at 14 in order to help support his family, and his school was terrible, and he left it without any qualifications. So he did not have that same opportunity. It would not work for him to have then been given access to a university or a job that required a degree, because he wouldn't have got there. The help needed to come earlier. It needed to, there needed to be a better school for him. His school was closed down on the year after he left because it was so bad. So we need to get the problems earlier so that people actually then can take advantage of opportunities, because one of the worries of trying to even things up is that it then puts people who haven't had the necessary background in order to be able to thrive in that situation, and then blaming them if they don't manage to cope with it.
Gotcha. It's more like raising the floor of opportunity rather than like even people who maybe were at the top go back to the middle or the bottom or something like that.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Cool. Well, thanks, Helen. I think that's pretty much our time.
Okay.
And any changes to your ratings by the end of this?
No, I seem to have argued against myself quite a lot more than I usually do, but I think that's because I'm used to sort of being attacked and defending things a bit more. So,
well, it's all about knowing the full case of it, and you did a great job. I love it. Thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, thank you.
All right, so thank you, Helen, for helping keep the truth alive. Where can people find you?
Well, I'm on Twitter under H Pluckrose, and you can find my work in areomagazine.com.
Perfect, thank you. And you also have a book coming later on this year.
Yeah, Cynical Theories, which is going to break down all of the postmodern ideas and how they've evolved over the last 50 years and how they're affecting us now.
Sweet, awesome. I'll have the links for all of that in the description. Thanks again, Helen. Hope to do this again sometime.
Yep, thanks, Reed. It's been good talking to you.
Thank you so much.